My son threw me out of the house I built with my own hands and handed the keys to a woman he had known for only 6 months. You have 60 minutes to pack your things. I've already changed the locks, he said, as if I were nothing more than an old piece of furniture. After 40 years of sacrifice, I stood on the sidewalk with a single duffel bag and a worn debit card my late wife had left behind. But when I walked into the bank the next morning to check that card, the teller looked at me and suddenly turned pale. He said one sentence that made my heart stop. "Welcome and thank you for being here." Before we continue, please like the video, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. This is a fictional story with some dramatized details to enrich the experience. Any similarities are coincidental, but the story carries thoughtful and meaningful insights. Now let's begin. The rhythmic rasp of 80 grit sandpaper against raw oak was the only sound in my Highlands workshop until the heavy thud of a designer heel silenced it forever. Alvin Wainwright, a 70-year-old master carpenter with hands calloused by 50 years of oak and cedar, stood in my Highlands workshop, finishing what I feared would be my final commission. It was a simple chair, but to me it was a conversation with the wood, a way to keep the quiet of the morning from turning into the loneliness of the afternoon. I had been in this house for 40 years, raising a family, and eventually mourning my Rose within these same four walls. I paused, running my fingers over the armrest, feeling the ghost of Rose's presence in the scent of sawdust. "Every grain of this wood tells a story, Rose," I whispered to the empty room. "I wish you were here to see this one finished." My son, Nathan Wainwright, 42, and looking every bit the high-powered CEO in a tailored charcoal suit, stepped into the workshop with a cold finality that smelled of expensive cologne and betrayal. Behind him stood Sienna Blake, 35, and polished to a blinding sheen, her perfectly manicured fingers resting on a designer purse that cost more than my first truck. I set down the sandpaper and tried to summon a smile, but the look in Nathan's eyes made my chest tighten like a vice. I thought perhaps he had come to help me move the finished pieces, or perhaps even to ask for a lesson in the craft he had spent his youth avoiding. Instead, he didn't even look at the chair. He looked at me as if I were a stain on the floor he was responsible for cleaning. "Dad, we need to be realistic." Nathan said, his voice flat and corporate. "This house is an asset, and currently you're an obstacle to its best use." My heart skipped a beat, the air in the workshop suddenly feeling thin and recycled. 60 minutes. That's all a lifetime of sweat and sacrifice was worth to my own flesh and blood. I gripped the edge of my workbench, my calloused fingers digging into the wood. "Nathan, I don't understand. This is our home. I built this place before you were even out of diapers." Sienna stepped forward, then her smile as artificial as the platinum highlights in her hair. Sienna's smile wasn't a comfort. It was the glint of a surgical blade before the first incision. "Alvin, Nathan has worked so hard to build Innovate Systems, and we really do need the space for the future we're building. You have 60 minutes, Alvin. The movers for the heavy things come tomorrow, but you leave now." I looked at my son, searching for a trace of the boy I'd taught to use his first saw, but I found only a stranger with a calculated agenda. Nathan flicked a brochure onto my workbench. It was for an assisted living facility on the other side of the city. "I've already made the arrangements, Dad. It's for the best. You're 68, and this house is too much for you to maintain." "I'm 70, Nathan." I corrected my voice, trembling with a mixture of shock and burgeoning fury. "And I maintain this house better than you maintain your own integrity." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the impatient drumming of Sienna's nails against her leather bag. Nathan didn't flinch. He simply checked his gold watch, a piece of jewelry that cost more than my workshop's entire inventory. "You have 55 minutes left. I've already changed the locks on the main house. Don't bother trying to go inside tonight." I felt the air leave my lungs, not because of a blow, but because of a word. The cruelty of it was a physical weight. I had spent 40 years building a legacy, and my son was treating it like a line item on a liquidation sheet. I moved with the heavy leaden steps of a condemned man, gathering the few things I could fit into an old canvas duffel bag. I took the photographs of Rose, my favorite chisel, and a few changes of flannel shirts. Sienna watched me the entire time, her eyes scanning the workshop as if she were already deciding which walls to tear down to make room for a home gym or a wine cellar. I walked out of the workshop for what I realized was the last time, the smell of oak following me like a mourner. As I reached the driveway, I saw a white van pulling up. A man stepped out carrying a heavy tool bag. I recognized the logo on his shirt, a local locksmith. He didn't look at me. He was just another contractor hired to perform a service. I stood on the sidewalk clutching my bag as Nathan handed a fresh set of keys to Sienna. I realized then that my son wasn't just taking my house. He was handing my entire life's work over to a woman he'd barely known for 6 months. My own flesh and blood had essentially evicted me from my own heart. I turned back to look at the oak door of the house, a door I had carved by hand with motifs of vines and roses for my wife. The locksmith began his work, the harsh sound of metal grinding against metal tearing through the highlands air. Have you ever felt the air leave your lungs, not because of a blow, but because of a word? I felt it then, the absolute erasure of my existence in the only place I'd ever called home. The locksmith's drill bit into the oak door I'd carved myself, and I realized I wasn't just homeless, I was being erased. The metal-on-metal screech was the final punctuation mark on my life, as I knew it, and as I turned toward the street, I had nowhere to go and nothing but the clothes on my back. The pavement felt like ice through the thin soles of my work boots, a cold reminder that the earth beneath me was no longer my own. Behind me, the metal-on-metal screech of the locksmith's drill finally ceased, replaced by the heavy echoing thud of a deadbolt sliding into place. That sound was the final period at the end of my life as a homeowner, a master of my own domain. I didn't turn back. I couldn't bear to see the house I built with these calloused hands standing dark and indifferent. Instead, I began to walk my canvas duffel bag feeling like a lead weight against my shoulder. I wandered through the Highlands, a neighborhood I had watched transition from dusty streets to rows of million-dollar glass boxes, much like the one Nathan and Sienna were currently toasting inside. Through a gap in the heavy velvet curtains of my former living room, I caught a glimpse of them. They were holding crystal flutes, the amber bubbles of champagne catching the light, while I stood in the biting March wind. They didn't even wait for me to reach the corner before they closed the curtains, effectively blotting out the ghost of the father they had just discarded. How do you measure a man when you take away his tools, his roof, and his name? I felt smaller with every step I took away from that property line, my identity eroding in the Denver twilight. The sensory contrast was overwhelming. The warmth of the workshop's sawdust was a million miles away, replaced by the sterile, metallic scent of the city's exhaust and the damp chill of a coming spring storm. I eventually found myself near a bus stop, my legs beginning to ache with a fatigue that went deeper than bone. I needed a place to sleep. But as I reached for my wallet to find a hotel, a new layer of the betrayal revealed itself. I tried the first card, my primary Visa. Declined. I tried the corporate account I still had access to for the workshop supplies. Frozen. Nathan, who had managed the family's digital transition years ago under the guise of helping me, had executed a total financial assassination. He hadn't just taken the house. He had cut the lines to every life raft I possessed. I was a 70-year-old man with a master's skill set and exactly $42 in cash to my name. I felt the first drops of rain, cold and needle-sharp, as I began to search for a place that wouldn't ask for a credit card I couldn't provide. I walked until the Highlands gave way to the neon-lit desperation of the outskirts, eventually stopping before a run-down motel that looked like it had been cured in cigarette smoke and bad decisions. The motel clerk was a man who looked like he'd been cured in cigarette smoke and bad decisions, squinting at me from behind a scratched plexiglass window that was yellowed with age. Cash only for the first night, old man, he rasped, without looking up from a small, flickering television. No cash, no bed. I counted out 35 of my $42, the bills damp from the rain. I've spent 50 years building cathedrals and mansions, and now I'm haggling over a stained mattress, I thought. But I kept my mouth shut. Dignity was a luxury I could no longer afford. Declined. The word on the terminal screen glowed like a brand in my mind, even though I hadn't even tried to swipe. The fear of that word was more paralyzing than the cold. He handed me a plastic key tag that smelled of industrial cleaner and pointed toward a door at the end of a dark, outdoor walkway. The room was worse than the lobby. The carpet was sticky, and the heater groaned like a dying animal when I kicked it to life. I sat on the edge of the bed, the springs protesting under my weight, and emptied my pockets onto the laminate nightstand. My keys now useless, my pocket knife, and my worn leather wallet. I opened it to count my remaining $7, my fingers brushing against the plastic sleeves. Tucked behind a faded photograph of Rose, my fingers snagged on a hard edge. I pulled it out, expecting a business card or an old receipt. Instead, I found a faded blue debit card I'd long forgotten. It bore Rose's name in simple, elegant script. I remembered her using it for her quilting supplies, and how she'd always offer a cryptic, knowing smile whenever I asked if she needed more for her hobby. "No, Alvin," she would say, her eyes twinkling. This little card has its own way of growing. The blue card felt warm in my hand, as if Rose's heartbeat was still trapped inside the plastic, a silent pulse of hope in a room that smelled of defeat. I wiped a layer of dust from the surface with the hem of my flannel shirt. As the grime cleared, my breath hitched. This wasn't a standard retail bank card from the local branch. Embossed in gold at the bottom was the insignia of a private wealth management firm, a name I'd only seen in magazines for the ultra-rich, or mentioned in hushed tones by the clients who commissioned my most expensive furniture. "Rose, were you always 3 steps ahead of the storm?" I wondered. My late wife had been a woman of quiet patterns and simple quilts, but as I turned the card over, seeing the high-security chip and the private contact number on the back, the mystery deepened. I stared at the name of the wealth management group embossed in gold, a name I'd only seen in magazines for the ultra-rich, and I wondered if I ever truly knew the woman I'd slept beside for 40 years. My hands began to shake, not from the cold this time, but from the sudden terrifying realization that my wife might have left me an anchor I wasn't even aware I needed. Monday morning arrived with the heavy metallic clang of the bank's front doors, a sound that felt like the gate to a prison or a palace, and I didn't yet know which. I stood for a moment under the grand vaulted ceiling of the First National Bank on 17th Street, my breath hitching as the conditioned air hit my face. After 3 nights in that motel, the luxury of a climate-controlled lobby felt like an insult. I looked down at my reflection. In the polished marble floors, my flannel shirt was wrinkled. My work boots were still stained with the ghost of Highland sawdust, and my hair was a wild mess I'd tried to tame with a splash of cold sink water. I felt acutely out of place, a rough-cut block of cedar sitting in a showroom of glass and steel. The bank lobby was a cathedral of currency, and I felt like a beggar who had accidentally stumbled into the choir loft. I gripped Rose's blue card in my pocket, my knuckles white and aching. Every instinct I possessed told me to turn around and walk back to the bus station, to accept the assisted living brochure and fade away like a weathered fence post. But then I remembered the gold embossing on the plastic and the way Rose used to smile when she looked at her quilting account. I joined the queue, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Just a balance check, I whispered to myself, a mantra to keep my legs from buckling. That's all. If it's empty, I walk away and find a bus station. I'll never have to see these marble pillars again. I moved forward with the line, watching the efficient, cold transactions of people who clearly belonged here. When it was finally my turn, I approached the mahogany counter. Thane Garrison, a young teller with a crisp white shirt and an eager smile that vanished the moment his computer processed my late wife's card, looked up at me. His nameplate caught the light, and for a second, I envied his youth and his certain place in the world. "Good morning, sir," he said, though his eyes were already scanning my rough appearance. "How can I help you today?" I slid the card across the dark wood, my hand trembling just enough to be noticed. "I'd like to check the balance on this account, please," I said. "It belonged to my late wife." Thane picked up the card, his fingers light on the plastic, and swiped it through the reader. He began to type a rhythmic clicking that was the only sound in my world for 10 long seconds. Then the clicking stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing into my ears. I watched as the blood drained from the young man's face, his professional composure evaporating into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He looked at the monitor, then at me, then back at the screen as if he expected it to explode. The teller didn't just look surprised. He looked like he'd seen a ghost holding a winning lottery ticket. Is there a problem, son?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Is the card expired, sir, please?" "Stay right here," Thane whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the lobby. "Do not leave this window. I need to get my manager immediately." He didn't wait for a reply. He practically bolted from his stool, disappearing into a hallway of glass-walled offices. I stood there frozen, the blue card sitting lonely on the mahogany counter. A security guard near the door adjusted his belt, his eyes tracking me. I felt the sweat prickle at the back of my neck. I was certain they were calling the police, that Rose had found the card in a dumpster, or that I was about to be charged with some high-level fraud I didn't even understand. But then the door at the end of the hall opened. Instead of a uniform, a middle-aged woman in an expensive navy suit emerged. Linda Garrison, the branch manager, was a woman whose sharp navy suit and professional composure couldn't quite hide the look of absolute shock in her eyes as she approached me. She didn't stay behind the counter. She walked right out into the lobby, her heels clicking a sharp, urgent rhythm on the marble. "Mr. Wainwright?" she asked, her voice rich with a reverence I hadn't heard directed at me since my last major restoration project. "I'm Linda Garrison, the branch manager. The system has been flagged for your arrival for 3 years. Have you ever stood in a room full of people and felt the entire world tilt on its axis because of a single look from a stranger? I felt it then. The patrons in the queue were staring, their curiosity burning into my back. Linda didn't offer a simple balance slip. She reached out, gesturing toward the private hallway. "Would you mind coming with me, sir? This account requires a level of security we cannot provide at a public window. We have a private viewing room prepared." I followed her, my boots sounding clumsy and loud against her graceful stride. As we passed the velvet ropes and the heavy security gates, the world of the lobby faded. We entered a quiet corridor where the air smelled of expensive paper and old, respected secrets. Linda led me into a room with heavy curtains and a single high-end computer terminal. She paused at the door, her hand on the handle, turning back to me with a look that was part awe and part profound concern. "Mr. Wainwright," she began, her voice a hushed whisper that cut through the silence of the private hallway. "I don't think you realize that you aren't just a customer. Today you're the owner of the single largest private portfolio in this district." My knees finally gave out, and I sank into the nearest leather chair, the silver key in my pocket pressing against my thigh, like a silent promise from a woman I was beginning to realize I had never fully known. The door clicked shut, sealing out the hum of the common world, and leaving me in a room that smelled of expensive leather and the kind of silence only money can buy. I stood in the center of the office, feeling like an interloper in my own life, my flannel shirt stained with the gray ghost of oak dust, and my worn denim seemed to absorb the light from the recessed fixtures. Linda Garrison didn't treat me like a vagrant, though. She gestured toward a chair that probably cost more than my first 2 work trucks combined. I sank into the leather, feeling the grime of the cheap motel and the fatigue of the Highland sidewalk clinging to me like a second skin. She offered me water in a crystal glass, the ice clinking with a melodic clarity that made the tap water from the motel sink feel like a distant, unpleasant memory. "I'm just a carpenter, Mrs. Garrison," I said, my voice sounding rough and gravelly even to my own ears. "I think there's been a mistake with the name on that file. I've lived my life measuring twice and cutting once, and I know when a board doesn't fit the frame. This wealth doesn't fit my frame." Linda smiled, a professional yet gentle expression. "Mr. Wainwright, the only mistake was that we weren't able to find you sooner. Your wife made very sure this remained invisible until the moment you needed it most. She explained that the faded blue card wasn't just a debit card. It was a physical key to a legacy management account, a high-priority trust that had been growing in absolute silence for decades. $12 million. The words felt like physical weight pressing against my chest, a hammer blow to my solar plexus that left me gasping for air. I reached for the water glass, my hand trembling so much the crystal rattled against my teeth. Linda turned her computer monitor toward me. To go any further, she required my thumbprint on a sleek glass security pad. I pressed my calloused, scarred thumb against the cold surface. For a second, the machine struggled with the worn ridges of my skin, the marks of 50 years of manual labor, before it chirped, and the screen flickered to life. A waterfall of data began to scroll. I saw a list of blue-chip stock portfolios, names like Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon. These were companies I saw on the news every day, companies whose products my son obsessed over, yet I never once dreamed that we owned a single shard of them. The numbers represented a 30-year trajectory of compound growth that Rose had managed from our kitchen table while I was in the workshop worrying about the price of cedar. "Apple, Microsoft, Amazon," I whispered, staring at the glowing text. We lived in a house with a leaky roof for 10 years because we couldn't afford the shingles. I remember Rose clipping coupons until her fingers were stained with newsprint. Linda shook her head slowly. "She wasn't just saving pennies, sir. She was building an empire. She was the architect of a future you didn't even know was being drafted." The computer screen was a window into a life I hadn't realized. I was living a silent world where my wife was a titan of investment, while I was just a man with a saw. I discovered then that Rose had set up a specific trigger with the bank. She had instructed her personal wealth manager only to alert the primary beneficiary, me, if my primary joint accounts were ever drained or frozen. It was a failsafe. She knew. Even back then, she knew exactly what Nathan was capable of before she even died. She had seen the hunger in his eyes and built a vault around me that he could never touch. I watched as the total liquid balance was tallied at the bottom of the screen. $12,482,000. I thought of the duffel bag sitting on the plush carpet by my feet, containing nothing but 3 shirts and a few old photographs. I thought of the motel room that smelled of stale smoke and the cold Denver rain. The powerless old man Nathan had tried to erase from the census was in reality the wealthiest man in this building. 12 million. "Rose, what were you doing while I was in the shop?" I asked the empty air. The grief hit me then sharper than the shock. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the fact that she had spent her final years protecting me from our own son. "She was making sure you would never be a victim, Mr. Wainwright," Linda said softly. "You spend your life thinking you know someone only to find out they were a silent titan holding up the sky while you worried about the rain." She reached into a drawer and pulled out a black titanium card, heavy and cool to the touch. She slid it across the mahogany desk, replacing the worn blue plastic. "This is yours, Alvin. It represents the full authority of the Wainwright Trust." But there was a final twist. Linda revealed that as the primary beneficiary of this trust, I didn't just have money. I had the legal right to recall any personal assets tied to the Wainwright name. The Highlands house, the land, the workshop, it was all tied to a corporate entity Rose had controlled. Nathan might have the deed in his hand, but I owned the entity that issued it. I had the power to take it all back with a single signature. My heart hammered a new rhythm, one of cold, calculated justice. Linda pulled a heavy, black lacquered box from her desk drawer, the Wainwright crest embossed in silver on the lid. "The money is only the beginning, Alvin," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There is a letter in the vault that you need to read before you do anything else. It's been waiting for this specific day for 3 years." The descent into the bank's basement felt like a journey into the underworld, the air growing colder and thinner as the heavy steel gate groaned open to reveal the safe deposit vault. Linda Garrison walked with a purpose that suggested she was guarding more than just physical assets. She was guarding the narrative of a woman I was only now beginning to understand. I followed her, my work boots feeling heavy on the concrete floor, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the reinforced silence. We passed through a second security checkpoint, where a silent guard nodded us through, and then we were in the heart of the bank. The vault was a cathedral of brass and steel, row upon row of boxes holding the secrets and legacies of Denver's elite. Linda led me to a private curtained cubicle, a small island of supposed privacy in this sea of locked metal. She provided the secondary key, her touch professional, but her eyes reflecting a deep curiosity. "Take all the time you need, Mr. Wainwright," she said softly. "This room is soundproof and your privacy is absolute. I'll be just outside if you need anything." I nodded, though my throat felt too tight to speak. I've spent my life working with wood and steel, but I've never felt a box as heavy as this one, I thought, as I slid the long metal container onto the table. The wax seal snapped like a dry twig in the silence. My heart followed suit. I stared at the envelope inside, recognizing Rose's precise, elegant handwriting immediately. It was a script I had seen on grocery lists, birthday cards, and the margins of quilting patterns for 40 years. Now it was a voice reaching out from the grave. "My dearest Alvin," the letter began. "If you are reading this, the worst has happened. Nathan's hunger has finally consumed his heart." I had to stop for a moment, my vision blurring. Even in death, Rose was still the observant one, the one who saw the cracks in the foundation before the house started to tilt. "I didn't hide this to keep it from you, my love. I hid it to keep it safe for you." She detailed her secret financial journey beginning in 1992 with small amounts of money she had saved from our tight household budget and the proceeds from selling her hand-stitched quilts. She had bought shares in companies I barely understood, Apple, Microsoft, Google, watching them grow while I was busy in the workshop. Her logic wasn't born of greed, but of a terrifyingly accurate realization that Nathan's character was fundamentally flawed. She had watched him grow into a man who measured worth in status rather than sweat, and she knew I would eventually need an anchor against the storm our son would create. The wax seal snapped like a dry twig in the silence. My heart followed suit, breaking under the weight of her lonely vigil. How could a woman who spent her days stitching fabric spend her nights outmaneuvering the giants of Wall Street? I wondered, feeling a wave of inadequacy wash over me. I had prided myself on being the provider, the one who kept the roof over our heads, never realizing she was building a mountain beneath our feet. The letter took a darker, more strategic turn, as she described watching Nathan's obsession with wealth grow like a cancer. She warned me that he would eventually view me as a static asset, to be liquidated rather than a father to be respected. Rose revealed that she had tried to warn me years ago, but my paternal pride had made me dismiss her concerns as mere motherly worry. She had been forced to act in secret, protecting me from my own blind spots. "Don't let him destroy what we built, Alvin," she wrote. "The money is a tool. The house is a symbol. You are the architect. Use this gift to set things right, not just for yourself, but for the family name." Rose's handwriting was a lifeline thrown across the chasm of death, and I gripped it until my knuckles turned white. There was a final instruction, one that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Check the back of the envelope, my love. I've left you a key to a door he forgot existed." I turned the thick stationery over. Taped to the back of the heavy paper was a small silver skeleton key. It was delicate, ornate, and entirely familiar. I realized then that Rose hadn't just invested money. She had made a move that Nathan couldn't have anticipated in his wildest corporate dreams. She had purchased a life lease on our Highlands home through a separate legal entity she controlled. Nathan might have legally inherited the title, but he had inherited it, subject to my right to live there until my final breath. His eviction of me wasn't just cruel. It was a flagrant breach of a contract he didn't even know was in force. My son had broken the law to throw me out of my own heart. I felt a cold, hard resolve settle into my bones, a feeling as solid as a piece of seasoned hickory. I wasn't just a carpenter anymore. I was the beneficiary of a master plan drafted by a woman who had seen the future and decided to own it. As I peeled the tape from the back of the stationery, the small silver skeleton key fell into my palm. A key that didn't belong to any lock in the bank, but to a hidden compartment in my own workshop that I had built myself and completely forgotten about. It was a secret space behind the oak paneling, a place where I used to hide my best chisels from Nathan when he was a destructive toddler. Rose had clearly put something there, something that would be the final piece of the puzzle. I stood up, the letter pressed against my chest, feeling the pulse of my wife's legacy beating against my own heart. I was ready to go back. I was ready to show my son what happens when you try to erase a master craftsman. The silver key felt like a shard of ice in my pocket, but the fire of a new, darker suspicion was already burning through the awe of Rose's fortune. I ascended from the vault, leaving the reinforced silence behind, but the weight of my wife's legacy didn't lighten. If anything, it became more complex. I returned to Linda Garrison's office, my mind spinning with the legal implications of the life lease and the secret compartment waiting for me in my workshop. But before I could plan my return to the Highlands, the bank's machinery had uncovered one more secret, one that didn't smell of lavender and foresight, but of rot and violation. Linda was waiting with another professional, a woman named Elena, whose eyes were as sharp as the spectacles perched on her nose as she dissected my late wife's financial records. Elena, our estate specialist, has found a series of anomalies during the mandatory trust verification. Linda said, her tone shifting from reverent to deeply concerned. We just need to clear these final credit markers, Mr. Wainwright. Wait, that can't be right. Elena's voice trailed off as she tapped a key on her keyboard, her brow furrowing behind her sharp glasses. What is it? Is there a problem with the taxes? I asked, leaning forward, the old anxiety of the poor man I had been for 70 years clawing at my throat. It's not the taxes, Elena replied, turning a thick printed credit report toward me. It's the activity. $75,000 in fraudulent accounts, stolen from a woman who couldn't even defend her own name anymore. The numbers on the page blurred for a moment before snapping into focus. I watched as Elena highlighted 3 high-limit credit accounts, all of them opened exactly 4 months after Rose's funeral. Elena's pen moved with clinical precision as she broke down the numbers for me, her voice dropping to a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would make the violation more real. Bank of America, $28,000. Wells Fargo, $22,000. Chase, $25,000. Each one opened with your wife's social security number, her birth date, and a forged signature that almost passed for authentic. My hands, still dusty from the workshop I had been exiled from, began to shake. Someone had taken Rose's social security number, her birth date, and the sanctity of her memory to open line after line of credit. While I was sitting in our living room, staring at her empty quilting chair and wondering how I'd survive a world without her, someone else was using her ghost to fund a life of luxury. These charges, they're for designer boutiques, high-end travel agencies, and networking events right here in Denver. Elena explained, her pen circling the line items with clinical precision. The Bank of America card was maxed out at a Nordstrom in Cherry Creek, just 3 weeks after the funeral. The Wells Fargo account paid for a luxury hotel suite during what appears to be a professional networking conference. The Chase card covered expenses at high-end restaurants and a private matchmaking service. Did your wife travel much after 2022? My wife was in the ground. By 2022, I rasped the words, feeling like gravel in my mouth. Someone is robbing a ghost. The violation felt physical, a secondary eviction from the history we had built together. How do you tell a man that his son might not just be a disappointment, but a grave robber in a three-piece suit? I looked at the signatures on the digital copies Linda printed out. They were loops and swirls of a hand that had practiced imitating Rose's script until it was nearly perfect. But it was too perfect. Rose's hand had a slight tremor in the final year, a detail a professional forger would miss by aiming for her younger, steadier hand. The address listed for the billing was a non-existent apartment building in Aurora, a nameless place Victor Madden would eventually have to hunt down. I discovered then that the primary email address listed for recovery on these fraudulent accounts was a masked version of a corporate domain I recognized instantly: Innovate Systems, Nathan's company. The air in the office grew cold. The betrayal didn't start when my son handed Sienna the keys to my house. It started while the dirt was still fresh on his mother's grave. My own son had allowed his corporate email to be used as a digital anchor for a theft against his own mother. The credit report was a map of a betrayal so vast, it made the eviction look like a mercy. Every designer dress Sienna wore, every expensive dinner they used to flaunt their success in front of me, was likely paid for with the stolen identity of the woman who had died, making sure they had a future. I felt a cold, calculated resolve settle into my chest, a hardness that no sandpaper could ever smooth away. This isn't just theft, Alvin Linda said, her voice dropping an octave. This is a federal offense. Posthumous identity theft carries a 15-year sentence. I don't care about the years, I replied, my eyes fixed on the forged signatures. I want to know who had the heart to look at her death certificate and see a business opportunity. I want to know how deep the rot goes before I start the demolition. The audit showed one final devastating detail. The very first withdrawal from the stolen accounts, a $3,000 cash advance from the Bank of America card, was used to pay a retainer for a high-end matchmaking service. It was the same service Nathan had bragged about using to find a woman of his stature, the service that had introduced him to Sienna. My son hadn't just been robbed. He had likely paid for his own predator using his mother's stolen soul. I looked at the date on the first forged signature. It was the day of Rose's 6-month memorial service, a day Nathan claimed he was too busy with work to attend. He hadn't been in the office. He had been signing his mother's name to a lie. I stood up, the crisp snap of the staple echoing as Elena organized the evidence into a folder. I didn't feel like a carpenter anymore. I felt like a man who was about to take a sledgehammer to a house of cards. I took the folder from Linda's hand, the blue-white glare of the computer monitor reflecting on Elena's glasses one last time. I'm going to need a detective, I said, and then I'm going to need a priest for what I'm about to do to my son's life. I slammed the audit report onto the scratched mahogany of the investigator's desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the cramped Lodo office. The air in the room was thick with the scent of cheap burnt coffee and the dust of 1,000 digital secrets. Behind the desk sat Victor Madden, a 50-year-old former Denver police detective with a face like a crumpled map, who looked like he'd been cured in the digital ghosts of people's secrets. He didn't flinch at the sound of the folder hitting the wood. He simply reached for a ceramic mug with a chipped rim and took a slow, deliberate sip. I stood there, my hands still shaking from the revelation of Rose's Memorial Day, my heart a drum of vengeful energy. I don't just want my house back. Victor, I said, my voice as hard as a kiln-dried plank. I want to know how deep the rot goes. I want to know who was holding the pen while my wife was in the ground. Victor leaned back his chair, groaning under the weight of his experience. Mr. Wainwright, when you pull a thread like this, the whole sweater usually unravels. Are you ready for what's underneath? Cleaning up family messes is the dirtiest part of my job, and usually the client ends up hating me for finding exactly what they asked for. I didn't hesitate. Rose saw something I was blind to, and now I'm the one who has to finish the job. Victor set his mug down and pulled the audit documents toward him, his eyes scanning the pages with clinical speed. Have you ever looked at a man you raised and realized you were staring at a complete stranger? That was the question burning in my gut as Victor began to point out patterns I had been too emotional to see. He highlighted the timing of the credit applications, noting they coincided perfectly with the week Sienna Blake first appeared in Denver. He explained the mechanics of a long con, where the identity theft of a recently deceased relative is used as seed money to fund the lifestyle needed to target the next mark. She didn't just marry him, Alvin, Victor said, his finger tapping the Aurora address. She staged an invasion. She used your wife's ghost to pay for the designer armor she wore to meet your son. The truth isn't a bandage. It's the scalpel that cuts the infection out. I felt the sharp edge of that truth as Victor revealed his first discovery. He pulled up a property record on his dual monitor setup. That Aurora address on the forged documents. It isn't just a random empty apartment. It was a short-term executive rental leased in Nathan's name 2 months before he even introduced Sienna to you. My stomach did a slow, nauseating roll. My son wasn't just a victim. He had provided the staging ground. You're saying my son is too stupid to see he's being robbed while he's helping her rob me? I asked, the words tasting like copper. Victor didn't answer directly. He just looked at the screen. People see what they want to see, Alvin, especially when they're hungry for status. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the black titanium card Linda Garrison had given me. Writing that check for the retainer felt like loading a rifle I never intended to fire, but the weight of it in my hand was the only thing keeping me grounded. I didn't care about the cost. I authorized Victor to dig into every corner of Innovate Systems Inc. and every alias Sienna had ever used. I want everything I told him. Every forged cent, every secret meeting. Victor nodded, his expression grim. Give me 3 weeks. I'll have the ghosts of your family on a silver platter, but remember what I said: once the sweater is gone, you're the one left in the cold. As I stood to leave, Victor stopped me, his eyes fixed on a small detail in the credit report Elena had missed. Wait, Alvin. Look at this. There's a recurring monthly payment to a firm called Aegis Surveillance. It's been active for 90 days. He checked a cross-reference on his laptop and looked up at me with a chill in his gaze. Someone has been paying for 24-hour surveillance on your Highlands workshop for the last 3 months. The chill Victor described prickled my skin immediately. I thought of the long hours I spent alone with my saws, thinking I was in a sanctuary of oak and memories, never realizing I was being watched through a lens. I stopped at the door, the chill of the surveillance news prickling my skin, as Victor added, "One more thing, Alvin, the security firm isn't Nathan's. It's owned by a holding company in California." I looked at the street below the Lodo district, buzzing with people who had no idea the world was made of glass. The grit of the city air felt heavy on my tongue. Why would a California company care about a carpenter's workshop? Why was I being hunted in my own home? Victor didn't have the answer yet, but his silence was a promise. I walked out of the office, the heavy door clicking shut behind me, leaving the smell of burnt coffee for the cold, uncertain reality of the Denver streets. I had 3 weeks to wait, 3 weeks to wonder which version of my son I would find at the end of this trail, and 3 weeks to prepare for a war I hadn't asked for, but was now fully funded to win. 3 weeks of waiting in a cheap motel room had turned my patience into a jagged edge, but nothing prepared me for the folder Victor slid across his desk, a dossier of a professional predator. The passage of time had been a slow, agonizing crawl filled with the hum of the motel refrigerator and the growing tension of the unknown. I had spent my days staring at the ceiling and my nights replaying the moment the locksmith's drill bit into my own front door. When Victor finally called, his voice was tight, stripped of its usual detective cynicism. I drove to Lodo with the silver key still weighing down my pocket. my mind racing with the questions he hadn't answered over the phone. Who was the California holding company? Why was my workshop being watched? I stepped into his office, and the first thing I noticed was the smell of old toner and a frantic, nervous energy in the air. The space was cluttered with even more files than before, printouts sprawling across every available surface under the cold hum of the fluorescent lights. Victor didn't offer me the usual burnt coffee. He just pointed at the chair. "Sit down, Alvin," he said. "We're not looking at a wayward daughter-in-law anymore. We're looking at a career criminal." He flipped the folder open, and the first thing I saw was a mugshot. The woman in the photo had the same sharp, calculating eyes as Sienna, but her hair was a mousy brown, and she looked 10 years younger. "This is Amber Morrison." Victor explained, his pen circling the face in the photo. "She doesn't just change her name, Alvin. She changes her entire soul to fit the man she's robbing. Sienna Blake is just the latest mask. Amber has been arrested for fraud in 3 different states, California, Nevada, and Washington. She's a ghost in the system, but her eyes never change. 6 names, 3 states, 1 trail of broken men and empty bank accounts." I felt a chilling realization of the scale of the deception. The glossy texture of the surveillance photos felt slick and oily under my fingertips. Victor began to lay out a series of other mugshots, a gallery of Sienna's previous lives ranging from San Francisco to Las Vegas. In each one, she looked like a different woman: a blonde socialite, a red-headed tech consultant, a brunette widow. But the eyes were always the same, cold, hungry, and entirely devoid of empathy. I looked at those eyes, and for the first time I felt sorry for my son. He never stood a chance. He was a man who measured his worth in titles, and she had built a mirror that reflected only what he wanted to see. Victor then dropped the first real bomb of the afternoon. He revealed that Sienna's platinum socialite background, the story Nathan swallowed whole, was funded entirely by a settlement she had coerced from her previous victim's estate in Reno. She literally used her last kill to buy the bait for Nathan. She didn't just meet him by accident, Alvin. Victor leaned forward, the light reflecting off his glasses. My social media forensics show she was lurking at the edges of his professional networking events for 6 months before they met at that charity gala. She studied his insecurities, his company's financial struggles, and even the exact date of your wife's death to perfectly time her entrance. How do you tell your son that the woman he calls wife spent months studying him like a lab specimen? The indignation rose in my throat like bile, a bitter taste that matched the cold office coffee. She wasn't looking for love. She was looking for a balance sheet with a weak spot. She used my wife's death as a doorway. That's not just crime. That's evil. Victor nodded grimly and began to pull out 2 other profiles. He laid them out next to Nathan's photo. This is a retired architect in California, and this is a widower in Nevada. Both were targeted within a year of losing their spouses. Both were isolated from their families, just like she tried to do to you. And both ended up bankrupt within 18 months of meeting Amber. Look at the dates, Alvin. She moves in when the grief is freshest. It's her signal. She's a vulture in a designer dress, picking through the remains of broken families to find the gold in their teeth. The dossier wasn't just paper. It was the anatomy of a predator's strike. I saw the identical tactics used on Nathan, confirming that my son had been selected as a mark from a pre-vetted list. He wasn't a husband to her. He was an exit strategy. I felt a grim moral clarity settle over me. The anger was no longer a hot, blinding flash. It was a cold, steady flame. I was no longer just a victim of an eviction. I was the only person standing between a predator and the total destruction of what was left of my family. Victor watched me, his pen scratching a rhythmic circle around a man's face in the background of a high-resolution photo from a gala held months before Sienna and Nathan met. "Wait," I said, leaning closer until the smell of old toner was thick in my nostrils. I pointed to the grainy figure in the background of the gala photo, the man whispering in Sienna's ear. I know that man, Victor. That's Nathan's right hand, his COO. If he's in on this, my son isn't just being robbed, he's being executed from the inside. The entire world seemed to tilt. The internal leak wasn't a theory anymore. It was a visible fact captured in a candid shot. I realized that the systematic destruction of Innovate Systems, Inc. had been planned long before Sienna ever stepped foot in our house. My son was being flanked by the woman he loved and the man he trusted most in business. I looked at Victor, the fire of resolve burning through my exhaustion. We need to go deeper, I said. I want to know exactly how much they've already taken. Victor didn't just open a file. He unleashed a flood of red ink that proved my son's empire was built on a foundation of quicksand and lies. I stood in the Lodo office, the metallic smell of old files and the dry heat of the laser printer stinging my eyes. We had spent the last hour moving away from the dark history of Sienna's past lives and into the cold, jagged wreckage of Innovate Systems, Inc. Victor pulled up the corporate ledger on his high-resolution monitor, and even with my untrained eyes, the rot was impossible to miss. A massive $1.5 million hole gaped where client deposits should have been safely escrowed. Nathan wasn't just struggling, he was drowning. Victor adjusted his glasses, the blue glare of the laptop screen reflecting in the lenses like a storm. He explained that Nathan had been using upfront payments from a regional healthcare system and a manufacturing plant to fund a lifestyle he couldn't afford. It was a cycle of borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, except Peter was a hospital, and Paul was a designer boutique in Cherry Creek. The company I helped my father build the reputation for honesty we had forged over 40 years was now a hollow shell. He's running a Ponzi scheme with corporate software. Victor, I whispered, the weight of the realization pressing down on my shoulders like a leaden yoke. It's worse than that, Alvin. Victor countered, his voice low and clinical. He's selling promises to people who save lives, and he's using the money to buy Sienna's silence with diamonds and high-rise dreams. $1.5 million. Poof. Gone into the ether of Sienna's greed. I felt a wave of professional shame so deep it made my hands shake. My father had taught me that a man's word was his bond, yet my only son had turned our name into a warning label for fraud. Victor began scrolling through a separate folder, one labeled with a string of dates from late 2022. He revealed a series of internal emails between Nathan and Sienna dated months before the eviction. I watched the mouse clicking through years of betrayal, the sound rhythmic and sharp in the quiet office. The messages were a masterclass in psychological demolition. Sienna had systematically eroded Nathan's confidence in me, whispering through the screen that I was dead weight and a static asset that needed to be liquidated for the company to survive. I read with a hollow heart as my own son adopted her cruel corporate vocabulary. He wasn't just listening to her. He was agreeing with her. Look at the timestamp, Alvin, Victor said, pointing to an email from November. This was the night of your birthday dinner, the night he toasted to your health. I remembered that night. I remembered the warmth of the wine and the pride in my chest when Nathan stood up to speak. He wasn't toasting my health. I rasped, the taste of copper filling my mouth. He was measuring me for a coffin. How do you unread the words of your only child plotting your homelessness? It was a question with no answer. Every line of text was a new splinter in my soul. I saw Sienna suggesting that my workshop space could be converted into a creative hub for high-value clients, and Nathan replying that I would be happier in a managed environment anyway. The manipulation was so thorough, so surgical, that I could see the exact moment my son's love for me was replaced by a fear of losing the life Sienna had promised him. Before I reveal the detail in the ledger that changes everything, I want to see if you are still with me. Comment justified or cruel, and add a short reason why you think Nathan made these choices. Please note, the next part includes dramatized details added to deepen the emotional impact and convey the core message. The purpose is reflection and learning. If that is not for you, you're free to stop watching here. Victor clicked into a final hidden thread of messages, and I felt the air in the room turn to ice. This was the final extraction. I saw an email from Sienna to Nathan's personal account, sent just 2 days before the locksmith arrived at my door. She outlined the exact plan to change the locks while I was at my workshop, ensuring I couldn't get back inside to reclaim any disputed property. She explicitly mentioned that once the old man was out, they could use the house as collateral for a private loan to cover the $1.8 million bank debt they were hiding. I waited for Nathan's protest for any flicker of the boy I had raised with a sense of honor. Instead, his reply was a single devastating word: agreed. Agreed. One word to erase 40 years. That's all it took for him. He didn't just sign an email, Alvin, Victor said, leaning back with a look of grim pity. He signed away his soul. The email thread was a noose, and my son was the one kicking the chair out from under me. I stared at the word on the screen until it burned into my retinas. He had consented to my ruin to save a failing empire and a lying wife. But the betrayal had one more layer. Victor found a hidden attachment in that very thread, a digital copy of Rose's death certificate, with Sienna's notes on the margin about the missing legacy trust. It was the proof I had been looking for. She knew about the wealth even before Nathan did. She hadn't just targeted him. She had been hunting Rose's ghost through him. I stared at the agreed at the bottom of the screen, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like the man who owned the bank that was about to call in his debt. I closed the folder, the cold, heavy weight of the evidence sitting in my hands like a weapon. I wasn't just a father anymore. I was a master craftsman, and I knew exactly how to dismantle a rotten structure from the inside out. The Aurora apartment complex was a concrete ghost, a place where people went to disappear, but I was there to drag my wife's stolen life back into the light. I stared at the peeling gray paint of the building as Victor pulled his car into a cracked asphalt stall. For the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like the man who owned the bank that was about to call in his debt. The drive from Lodo had been silent. The air in the car, heavy with the evidence we'd already uncovered regarding Nathan's corporate sins. But Aurora held the physical proof of the theft against Rose. We stepped into the lobby, and the stale, recycled air of the hallways hit me like a physical weight, smelling of industrial cleaner and forgotten lives. My wife never set foot in a place like this, Victor. I said, my voice echoing off the stained linoleum. It's too cold, too nameless. She spent her life surrounding herself with warmth and color. Victor adjusted his jacket, his eyes scanning the security cameras with a practiced ease. That's exactly why she picked it, Alvin, he replied. Criminals love a place with no memory. This is where the paper trail for Rose Wainwright began its second, darker life. We found the manager's office tucked behind a scratched plexiglass window. The building manager was a man named Miller, whose sweat-stained shirt and nervous eyes suggested he was used to taking money, to look the other way. He looked at my black titanium card when I set it on his desk, his pupils dilating as he realized I wasn't the kind of man he could easily dismiss. Victor didn't waste time. He slid a photo of Sienna across the desk and let a folded $100 bill peek out from under his palm. We're looking for the woman who leased Unit 402 under the name Rose Wainwright 2 years ago, Victor said. Miller's eyes darted from the money to the photo. He hesitated, his fingers drumming against a desk that smelled of cheap cigars. How many layers of skin does a snake have to shed before you realize it's been the same predator all along, I wondered, as I watched him. Miller finally reached for a dusty filing cabinet and pulled out an old lease agreement signed in person. I felt a surge of adrenaline as Victor compared the physical signature on that lease to the digital ones from the bank fraud reports. It was a match, but the real hammer blow came when he laid it next to a memo Sienna had signed at Innovate Systems. The loops of the R and the specific tilt of the W were identical. Miller leaned back his chair, creaking. I remember her, he rasped, his eyes fixed on the money. She didn't look like that socialite in your photo, though. She wore a blonde wig and big sunglasses every time she came in. But she had that walk, like she owned the sidewalk. She always paid the rent in cash. I felt a wave of nausea. She was practicing being my son's wife, while she was still picking my wife's pockets. My resolve hardened into something lethal. It wasn't just a discovery. It was an exposure of a parasite. I discovered then that Miller didn't just remember her. He had been a part of the machinery. He admitted that Sienna had been paying him a monthly fee to keep the mailbox active long after the lease ended. That was why the fraud alerts never reached me. She had built a fortress of silence in this concrete ghost of a building. A blonde wig, a fake name, a stolen soul. She was playing a part, and we were the audience paying for the tickets. Victor pulled up the building's digital archives on a tablet, showing me a grainy black and white flicker of security footage from 18 months prior. I watched a woman in a trench coat and a blonde bob-style wig approach the mailboxes. Even through the low resolution, the predatory grace of her movements was unmistakable. It was Sienna. She was moving with the money she'd bled from Rose's accounts, likely on her way to buy the very dresses she'd used to seduce my son. We returned to Victor's office as the sun began to set over Denver, casting long, jagged shadows across the skyline. Victor spent the next hour cross-referencing the cash withdrawals Miller had confirmed with Sienna's social calendar. The dates were a perfect, sickening alignment. Every hotel suite, every networking fee, and every high-end cocktail she'd used to accidentally cross paths with Nathan had been funded by the woman we'd just buried. She used Rose's life savings to build the trap that Nathan walked right into. I said, my voice barely a whisper in the dark office. She didn't just steal money, Victor. She made my wife pay for her own family's destruction. The evidence wasn't just a pile of paper anymore. It was the blueprint of a murder, and the victim was our family's honor. Victor sat back, the blue light of his monitors reflecting in his weary eyes. He had one final revelation. He had traced the very first credit account Sienna opened in Rose's name. It wasn't for clothes or travel. It was used to pay the initial retainer for Aegis Surveillance, the firm that had been watching my workshop for 90 days. Sienna was watching me with Rose's own money, ensuring I stayed in my place while she dismantled my son's life. I reached into my pocket and felt the cold, smooth surface of the titanium card. It felt like a shield. Victor handed me a final photo he'd pulled from the Aurora lobby's high-definition upgrade Sienna without her socialite polish, looking directly into the camera with a smirk that said she knew she'd never be caught. The look was so arrogant, so convinced of her own superiority, that it almost made me laugh. She thinks she's untouchable. I whispered the sound of the heavy office door locking behind us as we prepared to leave. She has no idea I'm about to buy her entire world. I stood in the low-dough office holding the smoking gun that linked her theft to the very foundation of Nathan's corporate life, and I knew the time for investigation was over. It was time for a takeover. I wasn't just walking into a law office. I was walking into a war room carrying $12 million as my ammunition and 40 years of betrayal as my resolve. The morning air in downtown Denver was crisp, but the heat of purpose burned in my chest, more effective than any heavy coat. I stepped into the lobby of the skyscraper, my thumb brushing against the smooth edge of the black titanium card in my pocket. Behind me, the world of dusty workshops and cheap motels was receding. Ahead, the elevator climbed toward the 64th floor, and with every floor I passed, the weight of being a victim dropped away. When the doors hissed open, I was greeted by the muffled silence of absolute wealth. Attorney Kenneth, a man with silver hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen every sin in the corporate playbook, sat behind a desk of polished obsidian. He didn't look up immediately. He was finishing a note with a gold fountain pen. The sharp, rhythmic tapping of his keys earlier having been replaced by the scratching of nib on heavy bond paper. I set the evidence folder Victor Madden had compiled on the obsidian surface. "I don't want to just sue him, Kenneth," I said, my voice steady and cold as the glass windows overlooking the city. "I want to own the air he breathes in that office." Kenneth finally looked up, a thin, predatory smile touching his lips. "In that case, Alvin, we aren't going to court. We're going to the bank." He explained the strategy of a debt-to-equity takeover. Nathan had defaulted on his primary commercial loans, and the bank was holding paper that was essentially a noose around Innovate Systems' neck. $1.6 million. A few clicks of a mouse to undo a lifetime of betrayal. I felt a grim satisfaction as I realized that the bank was actually 24 hours away from filing a public foreclosure notice on my house. If I hadn't moved today, the home I built with my own hands would have been lost to the state before I could even try to save it. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was using Rose's secret legacy, the very money Nathan had tried to steal through identity theft, to buy the ground right out from under his feet. Kenneth pulled up the incorporation documents. "We need a name for the shell company, Alvin. Something that sounds solid." I didn't have to think. "Summit Capital," I said. "Because I'm at the top now, and the view is very different." I watched the hum of the office's server cooling fans vibrate the air as I signed the papers. Birth of Summit Capital LLC. LC was a quiet affair, just a series of signatures on heavy bond paper that smelled of expensive ink. Is it revenge, if you're just the one holding the bill for a crime someone else committed? I asked myself that question as I watched Kenneth initiate contact with the commercial lending department at First National Bank. He offered them $1.6 million in guaranteed cash to buy Nathan's $1.8 million debt. The bankers, terrified by the looming fraud investigation Victor had tipped us off about, didn't even haggle. They were hungry to sell a dying asset to a man who didn't exist an hour ago. "My son thinks he's a shark," I whispered, staring at the cold glass of the office windows overlooking Denver. "He has no idea there's something much larger in the water now." The wait for the wire transfer felt like an eternity, yet it was over in minutes. I watched the dual monitor setup on Kenneth's desk flicker as the bank sent the digital confirmation. The law office felt like a sanctuary, but the documents in my hand felt like a sword. I was no longer just Alvin Wainwright, the master carpenter. I was the primary creditor of Innovate Systems, Inc. I was the man who held the mortgage on my own home. I was the one who could pull the plug on Nathan's entire existence with a single phone call. "The bank just sent the confirmation," Kenneth said, his voice reflecting the sharp, calculated energy of the room. "You are officially Nathan's landlord, boss, and banker." He threw me out for an assisted living brochure. I replied, the weight of the silver skeleton key in my pocket, a reminder of Rose's foresight. I think it's time I returned the favor. But Kenneth had one last revelation for me, a detail buried in the fine print of the loan agreement Nathan had signed in his desperation. The contract contained a specific morality clause. Because Nathan had committed active fraud against his clients, I didn't have to wait for a default period. I could seize his equity stake immediately. I could walk into his boardroom tomorrow and strip him of his title before he even finished his morning coffee. The printer hummed, spitting out the ownership certificate for Innovate Systems, Inc., with my name at the top. The white paper was warm in my hands, a stark contrast to the cold glass of the skyscraper. I looked at the name of the company I had helped build, now rightfully mine again. "Call the intermediary," I told Kenneth, my voice carrying the wisdom of a man who had seen the bottom and was now standing on the peak. "Tell Nathan an investor is ready to see him on Tuesday morning." I walked out of the office, the sound of the server fans fading, replaced by the quiet confidence of a man who had finally regained his name. Tuesday was coming, and Nathan was about to find out that some debts are paid in more than just interest. The glass tower of Innovate Systems pierced the Denver skyline like a shard of ice, and as I stepped into the lobby, I felt like a ghost returning to haunt the man who thought he'd buried me. The agonizing wait through the weekend had been a test of my patience, a long span of days where I had to keep the silver key in my pocket from burning a hole through my resolve. I had spent those 48 hours in deep psychological preparation, shedding the skin of the victim and donning the mantle of the owner. I was no longer the man who lived in the shadow of a workshop. I was the man who held the sun in his hands. The lobby was a cathedral of high-tech efficiency, smelling of ozone and expensive filtration systems. It was a sterile world that stood in sharp, jarring contrast to the honest sawdust-covered floors of the workshop I had been dragged out of just weeks ago. I walked past the receptionist, a young woman who didn't even look up from her screen to recognize the man who had been a homeless figure on a sidewalk not so long ago. Today, I wore the first expensive suit I had ever owned, purchased with Rose's legacy money, and it felt like a suit of armor. "I'm here for the 9 a.m. meeting with Mr. Wainwright," I said, my voice resonating with a steely confidence that surprised even me. "Tell him Summit Capital has arrived." She nodded, her professional veneer unbroken, and gestured toward the elevators. I stepped inside the smooth ascent, pulling at my stomach as I watched the floor numbers climb toward 20. The elevator chime sounded like a bell at a funeral. I stepped out onto the executive floor, the clinical ozone smell of the air conditioning filling my lungs. Through the glass walls of Conference Room B, I saw him. My son Nathan was pacing the length of the room like a caged animal. He was checking his reflection in the glass, adjusting the knot of his tie with trembling fingers and whispering to himself. He looked like a man who believed he was seconds away from a miracle, a man who had bet his entire life on the arrival of a mysterious investor who would save him from the fraud he had built. "He's looking for a savior," I thought, watching him through the transparent barrier. "He doesn't realize he's about to meet the judge." I paused in the hallway, catching a fragment of a hushed conversation between Nathan and a panicked assistant who had just exited the room. I overheard a detail that made my blood run cold. Nathan was instructing her to prepare the paperwork for a quick resale of the Highlands house. He planned to use the investor money to buy the deed back from the bank and then flip it immediately for a massive profit, showing that his greed truly had no bottom. He didn't even want the home. He wanted the liquidation. Does a man recognize the monster he created when it finally puts on a suit and sits at his table? I pushed the glass door open. Nathan was hunched over his laptop at the far end of the table, his back to the door, as he tried to stabilize a flickering presentation. I didn't announce myself. I simply walked to the head of the table, pulling out the high-backed executive chair. It squeaked as I sat down, the leather protest, a sharp sound in the silent room. I turned the chair toward the window, looking out at the reflection of the Rocky Mountains in the glass table, keeping my back to my son. "Good morning," Nathan said, his voice jumping an octave as he heard the movement. He didn't look up, his fingers flying across the keys. "I'm Nathan Wainwright, CEO. I cannot tell you how much we appreciate Summit Capital's interest. I've prepared a comprehensive presentation on how your capital will transform our trajectory and secure our dominance in the sector." I remained silent. The cold weight of the evidence folder on my lap felt like a stone. I could hear his shallow, panicked breathing from across the room. "I've seen enough of your trajectory, Nathan," I said, my voice low and rhythmic. "It's time we talked about the landing." I heard him freeze. The sound of his typing stopped, as if he'd been hit by a physical blow. The silence that followed was so thick I could almost taste it. I could imagine the gears turning in his head, the confusion at the familiar voice, the slow, dawning horror of a memory he had tried to suppress. The boardroom table was a desert, and I was the only well Nathan had left. He didn't move for what felt like an eternity. I waited, savoring the moment of total, absolute control. I was the architect now, and he was just the apprentice who had forgotten how to measure. "You sounded so different on the phone," Nathan whispered, his voice cracking with a fear that went deeper than corporate failure. "Dad." I didn't answer with words. Instead, I began to use the exact same terminology he had used on me, during that rainy afternoon on the Highland sidewalk. I mentioned that Innovate Systems was a static asset that had become an obstacle to its own best use. I talked about the need for a managed environment for his professional future, throwing every piece of his previous cruelty back in his face like a handful of gravel. I kicked the base of the chair, and as I swiveled slowly to face him, the blood drained from Nathan's face so fast, I thought he might hit the floor before I could say a word. He stared at me, his mouth agape, looking at the father he had discarded now sitting in the seat of power, dressed in the wealth of a mother he had tried to erase. The ghost had come home and it brought the bill. I didn't say a word for a full minute, letting the silence of the 20th floor press against Nathan, until he looked like he was suffocating in the very air he'd stolen from me. The only sound in the boardroom was the low, clinical hum of the air conditioning and the frantic, shallow rattle of my son's breathing. I stood up slowly, the movement fluid and precise, and began to walk around the perimeter of the massive mahogany table. I trailed my fingers over the polished surface, checking the grain and the joinery, as if I were inspecting a piece of my own furniture. I found a rough edge near the corner, a flaw in the veneer that most would miss, but to my eyes, it was an omen. "You always were a fan of shortcuts, Nathan," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet like a handsaw through soft pine. "You didn't even notice the foundation of this company was rotting while you were busy changing my locks." I stopped at the far end of the table and slid the Summit Capital ownership papers toward him. Nathan's hands were trembling so violently, the pages crinkled as he tried to pick them up. He stared at the legal language, his eyes darting back and forth as he processed the fact that the mysterious investor he'd prayed for was actually the father he'd left on a rainy sidewalk. "Dad, this is impossible," he stammered, the blood failing to return to his face. "Summit Capital. How did a carpenter get $16 million, 78%? That's how much of your life I own now, Nathan. Every chair in this room, every line of code in your servers, and the very desk you hide behind it, all belongs to the Wainwright Trust." I didn't stop there. I reached into the evidence folder and pulled out Victor Madden's forensic report. I laid it over the ownership papers, the white pages stark against the dark wood. I began to recite the numbers of his descent. The $1.5 million hole in client deposits, the fake invoices for the healthcare system, and the forged timesheets for a manufacturing plant that didn't exist. "You didn't just fail as a businessman's son. You became a thief, and you were going to sell our home like it was scrap wood, just to cover the smell of your own failure." Nathan collapsed into his executive chair, his expensive suit suddenly looking 3 sizes too big, like a child wearing his father's clothes to a funeral. "I was trying to save the company," he cried out, a pathetic, high-pitched sound that held no dignity. "I was under pressure. Sienna said we needed to maintain the image. Image doesn't pay the interest on a soul, Nathan," I countered, my voice dropping into a register of moral superiority that seemed to pin him to his seat. I reached into the folder one last time and pulled out the Aurora mugshots and Sienna's criminal records. I spread them across the table like a winning hand of cards. "Amber Morrison," I said, pointing to the mousy-haired woman in the San Francisco mugshot. "That's the woman you married. She didn't pick you because you're a genius, Nathan. She picked you because you were the easiest lock to pick." I saw the realization hit him a physical blow that made him wince. He tried to defend her, to mention their partnership, but I cut him off by sliding the printed emails across the table. I highlighted her words, "dead weight" and "liquidated," and his own one-word betrayal, "agreed." "No. She said we were a team," he whispered, staring at his own signature on the screen. "She said you were the one holding me back." How much does a man's pride weigh when it's being crushed by the truth? I watched him fold inward, his spirit, breaking under the weight of 100 different lies. But I wasn't finished. I had one more piece of ammunition, the cruelest truth of all. I revealed to him that I hadn't just bought the debt. I had contacted the bank 20 minutes before this meeting started and had every corporate credit card tied to his name frozen. He couldn't even pay the building's security to remove me if he wanted to. He was a king without a treasury, a CEO without a company. I leaned over the table, my face inches from his, the smell of high-end toner and his own panic sweat thick in the air. The slick, cold feel of the legal documents was the only thing between us. I had saved the worst revelation for the end, the one that would ensure he never looked at Sienna with anything but horror again. I dropped the ultimate bombshell. Sienna hadn't just used the money she stole from Rose's posthumous accounts for travel and dresses. She had used a $5,000 cash withdrawal from his mother's stolen identity to pay for the very engagement ring he had slid onto her finger. His entire marriage, the very foundation of his new life, was literally funded by his mother's stolen soul. And the worst part, Nathan, I whispered, the sound echoing in the silent boardroom. She's been robbing your mother's ghost since the day we put her in the ground, and you let her into the house to do it. Nathan let out a broken, choked sob and buried his face in his hands. He finally realized that he wasn't a shark. He was just the bait. I stood up and straightened my suit, feeling a strange lack of triumph replaced instead by a heavy, somber justice. I walked toward the door, my boots sounding loud and certain on the carpet. You have 24 hours to decide who you are, Nathan, I said without looking back. By tomorrow morning, either you're a man who helps me put that woman in prison, or you're just another criminal waiting for the FBI to knock. I left him there, a shattered man in a glass tower, as I stepped out into the hallway and toward the elevator. The war for the Wainwright name was over. The cleanup was about to begin. I left my son sitting amidst the wreckage of his own ambition, the glass walls of his office reflecting a man who had finally realized he was a stranger in his own life. The silence that followed my departure from the 20th floor was absolute, a stark contrast to the verbal demolition I had just performed. I stepped into the elevator, the doors hissing shut, with a sound like a guillotine blade. As I descended, I watched my own reflection in the polished chrome panels. The man looking back at me was no longer the broken, dust-covered carpenter who had been discarded on a rainy sidewalk weeks ago. My posture was straight. My expensive suit was unwrinkled, and my eyes held the cold, steady light of a man who had reclaimed his name. I felt the weight of the silver key in my pocket, a physical reminder of the secret legacy Rose had left for this exact moment. The elevator reached the lobby and chirped softly. I walked through the high-tech atrium, ignoring the whispered conversations of the staff, who had previously looked through me. They didn't know I was the man who now held the keys to their paychecks, and for the moment I preferred it that way. I stepped out into the biting Denver wind, the cold air filling my lungs and sharpening my resolve. I had given Nathan the truth. Now I had to see if there was enough of my son left to care. I drove back to my temporary motel room, the engine of the car I'd leased with Rose's money purring with a quiet power. Once inside the cramped, dimly lit room, I sat on the edge of the bed and set my watch. The 24-hour countdown had begun. Can a man truly be redeemed when the foundation of his new life is built on his mother's stolen identity? That was the question that haunted the small space, competing with the clinical hum of the motel refrigerator. I reached for my phone and contacted Kenneth and Victor. My instructions were clear: stand by to alert Agent Crawford at the FBI, but give Nathan until tomorrow morning to decide his own path. I wasn't just testing his honesty, I was testing his soul. I spent the long, gray afternoon looking at the only photograph I had kept of Nathan as a child, a grainy shot of him at 5 years old holding a toy hammer. I wondered at what point the wood had warped, where the line between ambition and evil had been crossed. Tick, tick, tick. The motel clock was the loudest thing in the world, marking the seconds of a life hanging in the balance. As evening fell and the city lights began to bleed through the thin curtains, a text from Victor arrived. He had been monitoring the digital periphery of Innovate Systems. "Alvin, we have a movement." The message read, "Sienna has begun transferring large sums from Nathan's remaining emergency accounts into a fresh offshore routing. She's prepping for a solo exit." I felt a surge of cold satisfaction. The predator was sensing the trap closing. But then a second notification flashed on my screen, this one from the bank's high-security alert system. My heart skipped a beat. Someone was attempting to access Rose's locked trust account using the legacy card. I didn't need a detective to tell me who it was. Nathan was at a terminal, trying to see if he could still salvage his fortune by plundering his mother's ghost one last time. Waiting for Nathan was like waiting for a storm to decide whether to break or pass, and right now the clouds were looking very dark. I felt a wave of profound disappointment wash over me. I had given him a lifeline, and he was trying to use it to steal the boat. "You're giving him a rope," Alvin Kenneth had warned me over the phone earlier. "You just don't know if he'll use it to climb out or hang himself." I stared at the blinking light of the bank alert, a digital scream in the dark motel room. My rage, which had been a cold, steady flame, flared into a protective heat for Rose's memory. I imagined Sienna back at the Highlands house right now, probably packing a bag in the bedroom I had shared with my wife for 40 years. She was likely sleeping in Rose's bed and using Rose's name to sign for her escape. The violation felt physical. I wanted to drive there to tear the door down and throw her out myself, but I forced my hands to stay still. Nathan had to be the one. If I did it for him, the redemption wouldn't stick. The shadow in the room seemed to grow longer. As the night deepened, the smell of rain-damp pavement and industrial exhaust drifting in through the gap in the window. I realized that my son wasn't just deciding between right and wrong. He was deciding between being a man or being the thief Sienna had taught him to be. I looked at the phone, waiting for it to ring, waiting for the one call that would tell me my son was still in there somewhere. The bank alert glowed on my phone, a digital scream in the dark motel room. And I realized that Nathan wasn't just deciding between right and wrong. He was deciding between being a man or being the thief Sienna taught him to be. I lay back on the bed, the springs protesting under my weight, and watched the red numbers of the alarm clock crawl toward midnight. I had given him the map to his own salvation, but I couldn't walk the path for him. The next 12 hours would determine if I still had a son, or if I was simply the last Wainwright left standing. I sat in the dark, watching the digital clock bleed minutes into the night, wondering if the blood of my son was strong enough to wash away the poison of the woman he called his wife. Every second felt like a drop of cold water on a hot iron. I had seen the bank alert the digital evidence of Nathan's lingering greed, and it had nearly hollowed me out. But as I stared at the motel wall, I realized that the alert I had received earlier wasn't a notification of theft. A follow-up message from Linda Garrison confirmed that Nathan hadn't been trying to withdraw funds. He had used the legacy card to trigger an emergency lock on the entire trust. He was protecting the money from Sienna, not taking it for himself. That small flicker of integrity was the first sign that my son might still be alive under the layers of corporate rot. Miles away in the Highlands house I had built with my own hands, Nathan was walking into the lion's den. He pulled his car into the driveway, the headlights sweeping across the oak door I had carved, and for the first time he saw the house not as an asset, but as a crime scene. He found Sienna in the living room, the space filled with the scent of expensive perfume and triumph. She was reclining on the velvet sofa, a bottle of vintage champagne chilling in a silver bucket beside her. Nathan stepped into the room, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, but his face remained a mask of exhausted defeat. He felt the weight of the phone in his jacket pocket, the recording app already running, capturing the clinical hum of the house and the sharp clink of crystal. "Did the old man sign the papers, baby?" Sienna asked, her voice purring with an arrogance that made Nathan's skin crawl. "Did we finally get what we deserve?" Nathan sank into a chair, avoiding her eyes. "He signed something, Sienna. He signed everything." The champagne cork popped like a gunshot in that quiet house. The sudden sound made Nathan flinch, but Sienna only laughed, the sound sharp and brittle. She poured 2 glasses, the fizzing liquid a celebratory hiss in the silence. She began to talk, fueled by the bubbles and the belief that they had finally won. Nathan pushed her, his voice low. and practiced asking for details on the contingency plan she had mentioned in her emails. He needed her to say it. He needed the truth to be as loud as the lie had been. Thinking they were alone and victorious, the mask finally slipped. Sienna laughed about the identity theft, bragging about how easy it was to use Rose's information to fund her hunt for a mark. "Your mother was a ghost before I even met her, Nathan," she said, her eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "I just gave her a second life to pay for ours. I didn't even have to try that hard. You were so hungry for a win that you ignored every red flag I planted. I was just a paycheck to you, wasn't I?" Nathan asked, his voice a hollow whisper. Sienna's laughter was the sound of glass breaking in a graveyard. "You were a project, Nathan, and projects eventually reach their completion date." Nathan listened in silence, feeling the vibration of the recording phone in his pocket, like a second heartbeat. He realized then that she had never loved him. He was merely a balance sheet with a weak spot. The realization was a physical weight, a crushing pressure that made the air in the room feel thin and recycled. Sienna continued to boast detail after detail of her long con, spilling out oblivious to the fact that she was weaving her own noose. Can a man's soul be saved by a single phone call made in the gray light of dawn? I wondered that, as I watched the first hint of morning sun touch the motel curtains. At exactly 7 a.m., my phone rang. I answered it on the first vibration. Dad Nathan's voice was a broken shell of its former corporate confidence. It was the voice of the boy I used to carry on my shoulders, stripped of all the artifice and arrogance. "Dad, she's a monster. I let a monster into our lives. I have it all on tape. She told me everything." He was parked miles away from the house now, the cold, early morning fog visible in the way his breath hitched over the line. He told me he was ready to face whatever came next, the fraud charges, the professional ruin, the prison sentence. He didn't care about the company anymore. He only cared about the fact that he had been an accomplice to his mother's violation. I felt a surge of profound grief for the years we had lost, but beneath it was a hard, shimmering grain of pride. My son had finally chosen the truth over the image. "Meet me at the federal building in 1 hour. Nathan," I told him, my own voice steady and fatherly for the first time in a decade. "We're ending this today." As we spoke, Nathan revealed one final betrayal. He had found Sienna's go bag hidden in the back of the guest closet. She already had a passport in a name he didn't recognize, and a thick envelope of cash. She had been planning to ditch him, even if the investment had gone through, leaving him to drown in the debt while she vanished into a new life. The predator had always intended to leave the mark behind. I hung up the phone and stood by the motel window watching the city wake up. The 24-hour clock had run out, and the man who called me was a man I could finally recognize. Nathan's voice cracked as he said the final words. "I'm outside the FBI office, Dad. I'm not running anymore." I grabbed my coat and the silver key, ready to meet him. The war for the Highlands was over. The march for justice was just beginning. The glass doors of the FBI field office hissed shut behind me, sealing out the morning traffic, and sealing in the finality of what my son and I were about to do. I turned to find Nathan standing in the sterile waiting room, his tailored suit rumpled and his face the color of wet ash. He was a shell of the man who had confidently evicted me weeks ago, clutching his phone like a lifeline, as if the recording inside were the only thing keeping him from floating away into the ether. We didn't speak. There were no words left for the hollow space between us, only the grim necessity of the truth. An agent emerged from the inner corridor, beckoning us toward the secure zone. We were ushered into a small, windowless interrogation room where Agent Lisa Crawford was waiting. She was a woman whose eyes held the weary patience of someone who spent her life counting other people's stolen money. I sat across from her, setting Victor's forensic files on the table with a heavy thud. "I'm not here to negotiate for my son, Agent," I said, my voice steady as a plumb line. "I'm here to ensure my wife's memory isn't the only thing he and that woman bury." Crawford nodded, her expression unreadable. Mr. Wainwright, this recording Nathan mentioned, it changes everything. It's not just corporate fraud now. It's a premeditated criminal conspiracy. Nathan played the audio. The clinical hum of the Highlands house filled the small room, followed by Sienna's sharp, brittle laughter. We sat in a silence so heavy, it felt like it would crack the floor as she detailed the identity theft and the calculated exploitation of our family. Federal agents don't knock. They arrive like a heart attack. Crawford explained that while Nathan's cooperation would be noted by the district attorney, he still faced serious charges for his role in the corporate fraud. I watched my son as he took the news. He didn't flinch. He just stared at the scarred laminate of the table. "You did the right thing, Nathan," I said, as we were escorted back to the lobby. "Probably for the first time in years. I don't feel like I did the right thing, Dad." He whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the office. "I feel like I'm finally seeing the wreckage I left behind." We drove separately to the Highlands, parked a block away, and walked to a vantage point that gave us a clear view of the house. I felt the biting Denver wind on my face, but I didn't feel the cold. I only felt the agonizing weight as the machinery of federal law began to move. Black SUVs began to idle in the parking lot of a nearby church, and I saw agents in tactical gear checking their radios. Can you ever truly go home again when the hallway smells of a stranger's betrayal? I looked at the oak door I had carved myself, the vines and roses now just ornaments on a crime scene. Agent Crawford had revealed that Sienna was already on a federal watch list for a similar scheme in Seattle, but they had lacked the insider proof to move. Nathan's recording was the missing piece, the spark that ignited the fuse. Suddenly, the street was no longer quiet. The SUVs converged on the driveway, tires crunching on the gravel I had laid myself. The breach was fast and clinical. They didn't need to break the door. They had the master code from Nathan. I watched from across the street, hidden in plain sight, as the Highlands house became a stage for a predator's downfall. Sienna was let out in handcuffs minutes later. Her socialite mask was gone, replaced by a look of pure, animalistic rage. She wasn't the polished beauty Nathan had married. She was a cornered wolf, her hair disheveled and her eyes darting with a frantic, hateful energy. Sienna's rage was a dying fire, bright and hot, but with no fuel left to burn. When she spotted us standing together in the distance, her face contorted into something unrecognizable. She began to scream, her voice tearing through the quiet neighborhood. "She's gone, Nathan," I said, watching as they loaded her into the back of an SUV. "The house is quiet again." "It's not my house anymore, Dad," he replied, his eyes fixed on the pavement. It never really was. It was just a prop in her play. The violation felt final, a cleansing through fire. But as the SUV door slammed shut on her screams, the neighborhood fell into a heavy, expectant silence. The blue and red strobing of the police lights against the white siding of my home felt like a warning and a blessing all at once. The smell of diesel exhaust hung in the air, a gritty reminder of the world's intrusion into our sanctuary. As the last of the vehicles pulled away, Nathan turned to me, his hands deep in his pockets and his shoulders hunched. He looked at me with a question that chilled me more than the arrest ever could. "Dad, did you hear what she said?" he asked, referring to her final poisonous scream, that it had all been his idea. "You don't believe her, do you?" I looked at the house, then back at my son. The truth was a heavy burden, and we had only just begun to carry it. The sirens faded into the distance, leaving us on the sidewalk, where this had all begun, two men standing in the ruins of a legacy, waiting for the long road to restitution to show us the way home. The SUV door slammed shut on Sienna's screams, and as the sirens faded, Nathan turned to me with a question that chilled me more than the arrest. "Dad, did you hear what she said? You don't believe her? Do you?" I took a deep breath, the dry, dusty taste of the Highlands air filling my mouth, and wondered if we would ever truly be free of the ghosts we had invited in. Justice doesn't always taste like victory. Sometimes it tastes like the cold gray ash of a fire that burned down everything you ever loved. As the FBI vehicles disappeared around the corner of the Highlands, the silence that rushed back into my home was suffocating. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time watching the dust settle on the gravel driveway. Nathan remained beside me, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with a silent, heavy grief. When he finally looked up, his eyes were searching mine for a forgiveness I wasn't yet ready to articulate. I didn't believe the poison Sienna had screamed as she was dragged away. I knew my son was many things, but he wasn't the architect of his mother's desecration. But the doubt she had planted was a weed that would take time to pull. I turned away from the house I had fought so hard to reclaim and looked toward the downtown skyline, realizing that the arrest was merely the end of the demolition. Now the rebuilding had to begin. I spent the following weeks immersed in a different kind of labor. Instead of chisels and planes, my tools were bank transfers and legal affidavits. I sat in Attorney Kenneth's office day after day, liquidating vast portions of the legacy trust Rose had built in secret. I wasn't interested in the wealth anymore. I was interested in the Wainwright name. My wife built this wealth with patience and honesty, I told Kenneth, as I signed another set of papers. I won't have it sitting in a bank, while people she would have cared about are suffering because of my son's greed. Kenneth tried to counsel caution, noting that I wasn't legally obligated to pay the full interest to the defrauded healthcare systems, only the principal. I didn't even look up from the check. I'm not doing what's legal, Kenneth. I'm doing what's right. I personally visited the boardrooms of the regional healthcare system and the manufacturing plant, offering not just the checks that would keep their doors open, but a sincere hat-in-hand apology. The scratching of my fountain pen on those high-value checks was the only sound in those sterile rooms, a rhythmic penance for the shame Nathan had brought upon us. A name is like a piece of fine wood. Once you gouge it, the scar stays forever. I felt a sense of craftsmanship in rebuilding our integrity layer by layer until the Wainwright name could be spoken again without a wince. By October, the air in Denver had turned sharp, and the trial began in federal court. I was forced to sit in the gallery, the cold, unforgiving hardness of the gallery bench pressing against my spine as the gruesome details of the identity theft were aired out for the world to see. I watched Sienna Blake sit at the defense table, her socialite mask finally discarded for a look of calculated, icy indifference. But the real pain came when Nathan took the stand. He looked like a shadow of the man he had been, his expensive suits replaced by a somber, ill-fitting blazer. He delivered a harrowing confession that spared no detail of his own complicity or Sienna's expert manipulation. When the recording of Sienna laughing about Rose's second life echoed through the courtroom, I felt the air leave the room. There was an audible gasp of disgust from the jurors, a collective recoiling from a depravity that exceeded mere financial gain. During the cross-examination, the final layer of Sienna's deception was peeled away. It was revealed that she had already started a new profile on another wealthy Denver widower while she was still living under my roof, proving that her supposed love for Nathan had been entirely transactional from the first second. How do you watch your own son walk into a prison cell and feel like you finally saved him? It was a question that haunted me through the final days of the proceedings. The jury didn't take long. They returned a swift verdict of guilty for both defendants on all counts of wire fraud and conspiracy. The judge, a man who looked like he had seen too much of the world's rot, called for sentencing immediately. He spoke of the sanctity of the deceased and the predatory nature of the crimes. Sienna was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Nathan, due to his total cooperation and the restitution efforts I had spearheaded, received 18 months. I watched the bailiff approach my son, the metallic jingle of the keys sounding like a funeral bell. As the handcuffs snapped shut, I saw a flicker of relief in Nathan's eyes. The lies were finally over. The weight he had been carrying for years had finally crushed him, but in the breaking, he looked more like a Wainwright than he ever had in a boardroom. "I'll be waiting when you get out, Nathan," I whispered as they led him past the gallery. Just make sure the man I meet then is someone your mother would recognize. He stopped for a split second, his eyes wet. Thank you, Dad, he mouthed, for not letting me get away with it. The courtroom gavel wasn't just wood hitting wood. It was the final nail in the coffin of my son's arrogance. The echoing boom of the gavel signaled the end of the Wainwright era of scandal. As the room began to clear, the smell of floor wax and old wood suddenly felt lighter. Then the judge delivered one final blow to Sienna's legacy. He announced that her remaining offshore accounts, the ones she thought were buried in the digital ether, had been seized and would be added to the restitution fund I was managing. Sienna let out a strangled cry of rage as she was led away, her power finally utterly stripped. I stood alone in the emptying courtroom, the silence returning once more. Agent Crawford approached me, her face showing a rare, soft smile. She handed me a small envelope Nathan had asked her to hold. He said, "You'd need this for the next project," she whispered. I took it, feeling the weight of it in my hand, and walked out into the crisp Denver afternoon, ready for the long road of absence to begin. The workshop was a tomb of sawdust and silence, until I broke the seal on Nathan's envelope, discovering that even in his darkest hour, my son had finally started to build something that wouldn't rot. I sat on my old workbench, the same one I had defended against the locksmith months ago, and let the heavy silence of the Highlands house settle around me. The court case was over, Sienna was gone, and Nathan was beginning his 18-month penance in a federal facility. I had expected the envelope to contain a legal request, or perhaps a list of debts he still owed. But as I pulled out the thick vellum pages, I realized I had fundamentally underestimated the man my son was becoming. Tucked inside were detailed hand-drawn blueprints and sketches of a vocational school. He had titled it the Wainwright Learning Center. Nathan had spent his final days of freedom drafting a plan to use the remaining family land, the very acres he had once viewed as mere liquid assets, to teach the trades and ethics he had ignored for so long. There were diagrams for woodworking stations, textile rooms, and business classrooms focused on ethical leadership. "You didn't leave me a bill, Nathan," I whispered, my voice thick with a surge of paternal pride. "You left me a bridge." I felt a deep sense of healing as I traced the scratch of his pencil on the set of blueprints, realizing that his first act of true penance wasn't the legal confession he gave in court, but this vision for the community he had nearly betrayed. 18 months. 540 days of counting the cost of a lie. The time passed in a rhythmic cycle of construction and correspondence. While I worked with contractors to lay the foundation of the center, the smell of fresh pine and wet concrete becoming the new scent of my life, Nathan was undergoing his own transformation. We exchanged monthly letters, his arriving on thin prison stationery that felt like a fragile connection across a vast chasm. Nathan described his daily routine in the prison woodworking shop, a place he had initially avoided, but eventually embraced. He wrote about the tough instructor who had no interest in his corporate pedigree, only in the squareness of his joints. The instructor here says, "If you don't respect the oak, it'll splinter your hands," he wrote in the fall of 2024. "I think I've been splintering my own life for 20 years, Dad. I've finally learned that you can't force the grain to do what it wasn't meant to do. Can a man's character be carved back into shape after it's been warped by greed?" I wondered this every time I walked past the rising brick walls of the center. I responded with updates on the building, sending him photos of the progress, and keeping my advice simple. "Keep your eyes on the wood, son," I wrote back. "The finish comes at the end, not the beginning." I discovered through a note from his counselor that Nathan had actually refused a good behavior early release that would have gotten him home by Christmas. He had insisted on staying until he finished his first complex furniture project, a dining table intended for our house. He felt that leaving before the work was done would be another shortcut he could no longer afford to take. April 2025 arrived with a crispness that suggested rebirth. I stood outside the federal prison gates, the cold, heavy clank of the metal behind me as Nathan walked toward the car. He looked different, thinner, certainly, but his eyes were clear and his hands were steady. We shared a profound, silent embrace, the first real connection we had shared without the shadow of a ledger between us. "You're thinner, son," I said, as we began the drive back to the Highlands. "But you look like a man who can finally hold a level." He looked at his own hands, his fingers tracing the coarse texture of his new prison-earned calluses. "I'm ready to work, Dad," he replied. "For real this time." We didn't go to the house first. We drove directly to the construction site of the Wainwright Learning Center. The building was nearly finished, the brickwork gleaming in the afternoon sun. I led him inside to the main workshop area where the first professional woodworking station was waiting to be installed. I handed him a chisel and a heavy mallet. The rhythmic thwack of the hammer hitting the steel echoed through the empty hall as we began the installation side by side. The prison gates didn't just open for a felon. They opened for a son who had finally found his way back to the workshop. Our hands moved in a shared, honest rhythm, the master and the apprentice, working without the need for words. We worked until the sun began to set, the shadows lengthening across the polished concrete floor. As we tightened the final bolts on the workbench, Nathan revealed a secret he had kept during his final months inside. He had used the small wages he earned in the prison shop to purchase a vintage quilting loom he'd found through a specialized restorer. "It's for the center," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "It's going to be the first textile arts tool we install. I want people to learn how to weave something that lasts. I want it here, in honor of Mom." I looked at the space he had cleared for it, realizing he had been planning this tribute to Rose's memory from his cell. Nathan wiped the sweat from his brow and looked at the Wainwright sign already mounted on the brick exterior, visible through the large workshop windows. He walked over to the curriculum board we had set up near the entrance and frowned. "We're missing something, Dad," he said, pointing to a large empty space on the board beneath the list of technical classes. I looked at the blank wood, wondering what piece of the puzzle he saw that I had missed in my focus on the blueprints. The smell of fresh cedar and floor wax was the scent of a new beginning, a fragrance that finally masked the lingering stench of the betrayal that had nearly cost me my soul. October arrived in Denver with a crisp golden light that made the newly finished bricks of the Wainwright Learning Center glow like a promise. I stood on the small wooden dais we had constructed near the front entrance, looking out at a crowd of Highlands neighbors, former business associates, and local officials. Many of these faces had been present when the scandal first broke, but today their eyes held curiosity and a newfound respect rather than pity. Beside me stood Nathan. He wasn't wearing a three-piece suit or a gold watch. He wore a simple canvas apron over a flannel shirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were now lean and corded from honest labor. He wasn't the CEO of Innovate Systems anymore. He was the lead instructor of a vocational revolution. I stepped up to the microphone, my voice steady, carrying the weight of 70 years of experience and the lightness of a cleared conscience. "True wealth isn't what you take from the world," I told them, my gaze lingering on the sign above the door. "It's what you leave behind in the hands of others. We're here to build more than furniture. We're here to build characters that won't warp under the heat of greed." I gripped the oversized scissors and felt the ribbon give way, a simple snip that signaled the end of my exile and the birth of a legacy Rose would have been proud of. Nathan leaned in as the applause rose, his face showing a quiet humility that the community had begun to respect. "I'm just here to teach what my father tried to show me 20 years ago," he whispered. "I hope I'm a better student this time." Have you ever seen a man find his way home by walking through a prison gate? I watched him shake hands with the neighbors, and I knew the answer was yes. I discovered shortly after the ceremony that Nathan had been quietly using his small instructor salary to set up a scholarship fund in Rose's name specifically for victims of financial fraud. He was becoming the anchor for others that his mother had been for me. By November, the center was humming with the sound of activity. The first class of vocational students was ready to graduate, and the diversity of the group was a testament to the need we had filled. There were struggling young apprentices looking for a path, and there were elderly neighbors like Mrs. Williams. Mrs. Williams, a 70-year-old former factory worker with eyes that sparkled with the excitement of a schoolgirl, stood proudly by her lopsided but sturdy coffee table. I watched from the doorway as Nathan knelt beside her, his hands guiding hers, as she applied the final coat of oil to the wood. "You have to listen to the wood, Mrs. Williams," Nathan said, his voice patient and low. "If you force it, it breaks. If you respect it, it lasts forever." The scene was a living testament to the curriculum Nathan had added to the empty space on the board Ethics in Craft. I realized then that the missing piece he had noticed wasn't a technical skill. It was the heart he had lost and finally recovered. "You sound just like your father, Nathan," Mrs. Williams said, patting his hand. "And that's the highest compliment I can give. 12 graduates. 12 lives mended by the hands of a father and a son." The satisfaction I felt was deeper than any profit margin I had ever managed. As the first heavy snow of December began to fall over Denver, the city turned into a quiet, white sanctuary. Nathan and I spent the late afternoon locking up the center together, the rhythmic clicking of the deadbolts, a familiar comforting sound. The crisp, biting scent of December snow met us as we stepped outside, and the warm yellow glow of the Learning Center sign reflected off the fresh powder. We walked back to the Highlands house together. It was no longer a disputed asset or a corporate trophy. It was a home. Inside, the sound of the crackling fireplace greeted us, and the air smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke. I went to the mantel and placed a final photograph of Rose there, one of her laughing in the garden. I could see now that the anchor she had provided through her secret trust and her final letter had held firm through the most violent storm of my life. We had done it. The house was full of life again. "Thanks for not giving up on the workshop, Dad," Nathan said, handing me a mug of hot cider. The taste of victory was sweet, but the taste of reconciliation was better. "And thanks for not giving up on me." I set my cider down and looked at my son, truly seeing him. The snow covered the Highlands in a white shroud, burying the old scars and leaving a clean, blank slate for the winter. Just then, Nathan gestured toward the corner of the living room, where a large object was draped in a heavy cloth. I hadn't noticed it in the dim light. "I secretly brought this over from the shop this morning," he said. He pulled the cloth away, and my breath caught. It was the oak chair, the one I had been sanding the day the world ended. It was perfectly finished, the smooth, polished feel of the wood a marvel under my fingers. Nathan had secretly worked on it during his time in the prison shop and finished the fine detailing after his release. It was perfect. I sat in the chair feeling the strength of the joinery and the grace of the design. I looked at the glowing sign of the center through the window one last time, before heading toward the kitchen for dinner. And I knew that while Rose's money had built the walls, it was the love we'd rediscovered that finally made this house a home. The Wainwright legacy was finally carved into something that would never rot. When I look back on everything that happened, I realize the greatest mistake I made was not losing my house or my company. It was ignoring the warning signs inside my own family. Pride can blind a father. I believed blood alone would keep us loyal to one another. But life taught me that even in a painful family story, trust must still be protected with wisdom. If my journey teaches anything, it is this: never let love stop you from seeing the truth. A parent's strength is not only in providing, but in guiding, correcting, and sometimes standing firm when the people you love lose their way. What began as a bitter dad revenge against betrayal eventually became something deeper, a chance to rebuild what was broken. This family story reminded me that revenge alone never heals. Accountability and forgiveness do. There were moments when anger nearly consumed me. But through the storm, I learned patience, and I believe God allowed this trial so I could understand the difference between justice and hatred. In the end, my dad revenge was not about destroying my son. It was about saving what remained of our name. That lesson became the heart of this family story. Real strength is rebuilding, not simply winning. So if you ever face betrayal, like I did, remember this: stand for truth, protect your dignity, and never let bitterness become your legacy. Even in the darkest chapters, redemption is possible. My dad's revenge began with anger, but it ended with a second chance. Thank you for staying with me through this journey to the very end. I'd truly like to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if you were in Alvin's position, forced to choose between justice and forgiveness? Share your perspective in the comments below. If this story moved, you consider subscribing so you don't miss future stories. A gentle note: while this narrative draws inspiration from real-world family conflicts and financial fraud themes, certain elements were dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this kind of content isn't your preference, feel free to explore other videos on the channel that may suit you better.